Today is Friday, July 31st, 2026, and I am here with Benjamin. And we are going to talk about the months leading up to and his time spent at the Brain and Spine Rehab in the Netherlands.
Chapter 11 Stroke Rebel. Unlike the first medical leave, I had nothing to detox from. The body had nothing to recover from in the way it had recovered from Adderall the year before. No 3 weeks of sleeping on the couch, no zombified days. What remained was just me. So I pushed harder, and the second medical leave wasn't recovery, it was another version of the same engine. For the 3 months between February and May of 2022, I went into the garage in the dark before the sun rose and ran a 30 to 45 minute yin yoga session. In yin yoga, you hold each pose for 3 to 5 minutes at a time. No flow, no movement, just sitting inside a single shape long enough that the mind has nowhere to hide from itself. By the end of every session, my whole body was shaking, the body breaking down from being asked to sit inside itself with no other stimuli to react to, nothing to look at, nothing to hear, just whatever was surfacing in the body. The belief was still in me that if I pushed harder and did more, I would recover. So the day kept going. Yoga, rehab, the gym, the same regimen of slow, controlled lifts I had been running in Evanston. And by the time I was leaving the gym, the frustration with the state of my body would push me over the cliff back into the habit of smoking marijuana. Then the shame and the guilt would wash over me for being on my second medical leave, this one for marijuana, and still needing to smoke, still needing to get high to make it through the day I had structured to heal. The shame and the guilt opened the pit. The first smoke would need a second, the second would need a third. I'd try to fill the pit, and when the smoking stopped reaching it, I'd binge, sometimes purge. The 3 months ran like that. A few days clean, a few days back in the cycle, a few days clean again, a few days back, smoke, binge, sometimes purge, then a stretch of nothing, a day, 2 days, maybe 3, before something would crack and the cycle would pick back up. The shape of the leaf wasn't a line, it was a wave, and the clean days weren't different. Nothing had shifted in me, it was just willpower holding the behavior off, and I knew the whole time that the behavior would return with greater force in a day or 2 or 3. The rest of those 3 months was a blur. Nothing really stuck out across the stretch, nothing except the decision. A Zoom call with the founders of a stroke clinic in Zutphen, the Netherlands, Arjan and Linda, a brain and spine rehab doing work I hadn't been able to find anywhere in the United States, and Linda's book, Stroke Rebel, which I read in the weeks leading up to that call. I saw myself in Linda, being the youngest in her family the way I was the youngest in mine, a perfectionist who refused to accept the limits the doctors had placed on her recovery. It wasn't one passage that landed, it was the cumulative weight of the book, of seeing myself in her story across every chapter. By the time I finished reading it, I knew I was going to the right place. Mid-May. My mother and I were on a flight from Houston to Amsterdam, then a train from Schiphol Airport to Deventer. The overwhelming feeling was hope that I was going to further my physical recovery, going to a place that looked at the brain through a different lens than the doctors at the hospital had used 4.5 years earlier. Those doctors had told me that the first 6 months after a stroke was the only window for meaningful recovery. Whatever I hadn't recovered by March of 2018 was the body I was going to be in for the rest of my life. That was their verdict, not mine. That was what every doctor I had seen since had repeated in some form. In Zutphen, the brain was looked at differently. The clinic had been built around the belief that recovery was possible beyond what the conventional timeline said, that the brain could continue to rewire, continue to relearn, continue to repair For years after the event, I was going to a place that believed what I had refused to stop believing about my own body, and the hope filled the pit. I knew how temporary that filling was. The pit had been filled by external things since June of 2018. Student coach, health and wellness, party boy, bodybuilder, Adderall, marijuana. Every external answer to an internal question. Hope was just the latest, but for the flight from Houston to Amsterdam and the train from Schiphol to Deventer, hope held. The pit was full. The free fall had stopped. For the 2 weeks in Zutphen, my mother was more than present. She filmed almost every exercise of every hour of every day. The whole library of work I was doing at the clinic recorded on her phone so I would have it after we left. So the work could keep going in Houston. The days at the clinic ran from 9 to 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I'd arrive in the morning and start with red light therapy, then physical therapy, beginning on my back like a baby, then brain training exercises right before lunch. After lunch, I'd be in the oxygen chamber, then more physical therapy, more brain training, and at the end of every day, a meeting with Arjan. That was the structure, every day for 2 weeks. But the structure wasn't what made it different. What made it different was the feeling I had every day inside the clinic of being seen as a stroke patient, of not having to hide what my body and my brain couldn't do, of not having to perform a version of myself that the people around me would find acceptable. The clinic was a room where having a brain or spine injury was the entry condition, not the secret. I could be exactly who I was. It wasn't any single piece of the architecture that made Zutphen different. It was the integration of body work, brain work, oxygen, light, and the daily meeting at the end. The American stroke care I had since 2017 had been a series of separate appointments, physical therapy at one place, occupational therapy at another, neurology elsewhere, each provider working on a different piece of the body or the brain, with nobody integrating the work into a single direction. Zutphen treated the body and the brain as one system being worked on at the same time every day by people who talked to each other. And then there was the run. It came at the end of the second week, a Thursday or Friday. My trainer and I went out for a walk-run regimen about 30 minutes around the streets of Zutphen, pavement under my feet. The first time I had run since the football field in September of 2017. We ran using a metronome, 130 to 150 beats per minute. That's what I locked in on. Match the beat, pick up, come down, pick up, come down. The metronome was the thing I followed. The body kept up, and the hope kept filling the pit. At the end of the 2 weeks, my mom and I were headed to Den Haag to visit longtime family friends and stay with them for a couple of days. But before we left Zutphen, Linda called me into her office and she invited me to come back. The clinic was opening a second location in Cyprus the following year, and she wanted me there as a volunteer when it did. I had been one of their guinea pigs in Zutphen, one of the first stroke clients they had ever taken, and now they wanted me back as part of the next phase. Linda and Arjan felt like family, even though we'd only known each other 2 weeks. After leaving Zutphen, we stayed in Den Haag for 4 days, and the first 3 days were fine. The first day we explored the city. The second day we took a day trip to Delft, exploring the university our friends had attended, and then seeing the town itself. The third day we were out exploring Den Haag again in the morning until we got caught in the rain in the afternoon. The fasting was still running underneath. 1 meal a day. Espressos throughout the morning and the day. My normal. No one noticed. On the fourth day, the day before we left, I went out for a walk around Den Haag in the morning. The walk was planned. What happened next wasn't. The same unconscious self that had walked me into Pizza Hut and CVS in 2019, into delivery apps in January of 2022, took over again. There was no ability for the conscious self to intervene. My consciousness left the body. I watched myself from the third person as the body walked into an Albert Heijn, a Dutch grocery store, through the aisles, picking up what it wanted: Ben and Jerry's, Tony's chocolate bars, cookies, bread, anything I recognized and could get my hands on. Then back to the apartment to binge. I purged in the bathroom right after. The next day, my mother and I were on a flight back to Houston, and what I sat with on the flight home was the exhaustion of the contradiction. A couple of weeks without a binge, a purge, or marijuana, the longest I'd held in months. And then 24 hours before the flight home, the unconscious self took over again. The binge, the purge. Hope had filled the pit on the way over. Shame had refilled it 24 hours before the return home. Both feelings sat in the same hole. Because that was all the hope had ever been. One more thing to fill the pit. Zutphen was real, the brain rehabilitation was real, but the hope I carried out of it was the same hope I'd carried into every external answer since June of 2018, and it filled the hole the same way for the same short while, until something cracked it open again. And I was heading back to the environment where I knew the cycle would intensify.